Kalen Voss turned his back on the most powerful royal in the sector and walked out of the hall in a silence so heavy it felt like a declaration of war. Archon Lyssandra's laughter died mid-breath, her golden solar circlet glinting like a jagged halo as she stared at the human's retreating spine. The air in the apex zenith is getting thin, and I have to wonder if you're brave enough to walk away when the cost is everything. Subscribe to see if the silence breaks before the galaxy does. Now let's look at how the fire started. 6 hours earlier, the tea in the delegate lounge had gone cold, a stagnant pool of amber reflecting the shimmering spires of Ethelgard. I watched Voss through the crystalline partition, his hands steady as he adjusted the cuffs of his simple charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the opulence of the hegemony. As a junior attaché for the hegemony, my job was to observe, to record, and to ensure the primitive children didn't smudge the silk tapestries of the apex zenith. I stood in the shadow of a fluted pillar, my data stylus hovering. The humans were small. They were young. Their history was a mere blip compared to the 10,000 years of Ethelgard dominance. Archon Lysandra had made sure to remind them of that the moment they stepped off their shuttle, her voice dripping with the kind of honeyed poison only an immortal can brew. She sat upon the high dais, the solar circlet resting atop her brow. It was an ancient thing, forged from a dying star's heart, pulsing with a rhythmic, arrogant light. To us, it was the soul of the hegemony. To Voss, it seemed to be nothing more than an oversized trinket. The negotiations were a farce. Lysandra didn't want trade. She wanted a performance of televised submission. She lounged back, her many-jointed fingers drumming against the armrest. The galaxy doesn't respect age, she purred, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. It respects the competence to stay alive. And you, little Terran, look quite fragile. The court erupted. My own kin, dressed in graviton-spun robes, hissed their amusement. I watched Voss. He didn't flush. He didn't stammer. He simply stood at the center of the hall, his eyes fixed on the Archon with a terrifyingly neutral intensity. He looked like a man measuring a grave. Archon Lysandra leaned forward, the solar circlet flaring. Tell me, Voss, do you even have a word for empire in your gutter tongue? Or are you still preoccupied with fire and wheels? The laughter was a physical weight, pressing down on the small human delegation. Voss's companions shifted, their faces tight with suppressed rage, but Voss remained a statue of flesh and bone. He let the mockery wash over him, a stone in a shallow stream. A messenger approached me then, whispering that the docking bays were being cleared for a private departure. If you want to know why the docks went quiet, subscribe and stay close as the tide turns. This was only the beginning of the end. The silence that followed Lysandra's insult lasted exactly 30 seconds. I timed it on my internal chronometer. It was the most uncomfortable half-minute of my life. In the hegemony, we fill every gap with music or poetry. We fear the void, but Voss seemed to live in it. He didn't offer a rebuttal. He didn't defend his species' honor. He simply turned. The sound of his leather shoes on the polished floor echoed like a drumbeat. Step, step, step. He reached the grand doors, and for a moment I thought he might look back. I thought he might give her the satisfaction of a final, angry word. Instead, he signaled to his team with a sharp two-finger gesture. Within the hour, the silent withdrawal began. It wasn't a riot. It was an erasure. I stood on the observation deck watching the data feeds. It started with the medical wings. Human doctors who had been treating our elite for decades simply packed their kits and walked to the hangars. They didn't sign out. They didn't hand over patient files. They just left. Then came the engineers in the sublevels of the zenith, the ones who kept the atmosphere processors from grinding to a halt. One by one, their biometric signatures blinked out. The hegemony had grown fat and lazy on the labor of those we called primitives. We had forgotten that while we held the titles, they held the tools. Lysandra was furious. I saw her in the war room, her face pale, the solar circlet tilted slightly askew as she screamed for the human ships to be seized. But they were already gone, slipping into the slipstream with a haunting coordination. They didn't just leave our stations. They left our markets. They pulled their agricultural subsidies. They vanished from our research councils. And then, the predatory eyes of the galaxy began to turn toward us. The Scorvash swarm, a collective of chitin and hunger that had been held at bay by human border patrols, sensed the vacuum. They didn't care about our 10,000-year history. They only saw a giant that had suddenly lost its armor. The hegemony sensors didn't just pick up the Scorvash swarm. They felt them. A million chittering signals began to gnaw at our outer rim like a plague of locusts on a glass house. Without the human scouts to thin their numbers, the silence Voss left behind was filled by the sound of our own borders collapsing. A crown doesn't make a leader, the dirt under their fingernails does. Subscribe to witness the fall of a queen and the birth of a soldier in tomorrow's final dispatch. The shift happened faster than our archives could record. Within 48 hours of the withdrawal, the Ethelgard economy didn't just dip, it evaporated. I stood in the central hub, watching the golden light of the spires flicker as the power grids, once maintained by human thermal engineers, began to stutter and fail. Lysandra's court, once a sea of arrogance, was now a drowning pool. They realized too late that their primitive guests hadn't been servants. They had been the scaffolding. As the swarm tore through the 7th sector, our ancient, gilded warships proved to be nothing more than ornamental targets. We had the technology of gods, but we had forgotten the grit of survival. The Archon's desperation finally outpaced her pride. I was there when she stripped the solar circlet from her brow and threw it into a velvet-lined case. It wasn't a gesture of humility, not yet, but one of survival. The journey to Terra Nova took 3 days. I accompanied her, watching as she paced the length of her private shuttle, her fingers twitching where the weight of the circlet used to be. When we arrived at the human capital, there were no trumpets, no golden carpets, only a quiet, functional spaceport and a 3-day wait in a sterile lobby that smelled of ozone and recycled air. Voss didn't see her until the 4th day. When he finally opened his doors, he wasn't wearing a suit. He was in fatigues, grease on his forearms, looking like a man who had been rebuilding a world while we were losing ours. Lysandra didn't beg immediately. She tried to negotiate. She offered gems, star charts, and ancient secrets. Voss let her speak for 10 minutes before he pointed to the window, toward the horizon where human recruits were training in the mud. "You called us children," Voss said, his voice as level as the day he walked out. "Children learn. Adults just get old and brittle. If you want our steel, you'll have to learn how we forge it." And now, in the command bunker overlooking the Ethelgard front, the silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic thrum of human dropships. Voss stood at the holographic map, his eyes tracing the swarm's advance. Lysandra stood 3 steps behind him, not as a sovereign, but as a soldier. Her silk robes were gone, replaced by the matte gray plating of a standard-issue human combat rig. The solar circlet was 1,000 light-years away, locked in a dark box. In its place, she wore a comms headset and a streak of carbon scoring across her cheek. "The swarm is breaking through the 3rd moon's shadow," I reported, my own hands shaking as I monitored the feed. Voss didn't look back. He just nodded toward Lysandra. "Lead the breach. Show them what happens when an empire stops pretending." Lysandra didn't hesitate. She grabbed her rifle, the weight of it clearly unfamiliar but her grip tightening with a new kind of resolve. She didn't look like a royal. She looked like someone who finally understood that power wasn't a gift of birth, but a debt paid in blood and effort. The battle lasted 14 hours. I watched the telemetry as Lysandra's unit dove into the thick of the chitinous tide. They didn't use the elegant, distance-based weapons of the hegemony. They used human tactics, brutal, adaptive, and relentlessly close. I saw the Archon's signature move through the carnage, a spark of stubborn life refusing to be extinguished. When the swarm finally broke and retreated into the dark, the silence that returned to the sector was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of a declaration of war. It was the quiet, exhausted breath of a survivor. Days later, back on the high dais of the Zenith, the court was gathered again. But the atmosphere had changed. The silk tapestries were torn, and the air smelled of smoke. Lysandra walked to the center of the hall, her combat armor still stained with the dust of the front lines. She reached into a small bag and pulled out the solar circlet. For a moment, the court held its breath, expecting her to place it back on her head and return to the old ways. Instead, she set it on the floor at Voss's feet. "The galaxy doesn't respect age," she said, echoing her own insult from weeks before. "But it respects the competence to stay alive. We were old and we were blind. Today we start over." Voss didn't take the crown. He didn't even look at it. He looked at Lysandra, reaching out a hand to pull her up as an equal. I looked down at my data stylus, then at the golden trinket lying abandoned on the tiles. It looked smaller now, less like a sun, and more like a heavy piece of metal that had finally been set down. In the corner of the room, a human engineer was already working on the power relays, his hands covered in the same grime that now marked the Archon's palms. The hegemony hadn't been saved by weapons. It had been saved by the dirt under a queen's fingernails.